You might think you've already heard it all when it comes to family stories, but this one will shake your nerves. Imagine raising 3 children as if they were your own, giving them love, education, warm meals, comfort on the hard days, tough lessons when needed, all of that for 15 years. Now imagine that suddenly, the children's biological mother comes back not to say thank you, not to apologize, but to accuse you of kidnapping. Sounds like a soap opera plot, right? But that's exactly what happened to Mary Brower. This story begins with a silent betrayal, a mother who abandoned her children without explanation. Time went by, bonds grew stronger, the boys became young men, and the truth gained weight. What no one expected was that the past would be used as a weapon, in a courtroom where 15 years of love would be questioned through documents, judgments, and inheritances. A single brown envelope would hold the only chance to prove it all. And in the middle of this chaos rises the question nobody wants to ask out loud: how far will someone go for money, revenge, or pride? And how far would you go for justice, for true love, and for protecting your family? Brace yourself. This is more than a custody battle. It's a cruel and very real portrait of sacrifice, pain, and rebuilding. Every chapter hides a twist. And it all begins in the courtroom. If you value true stories that make us reflect on love, choices, and consequences, stay until the end. And of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of this emotional journey. It was as if time had stopped in that room. The ticking clock on the wall seemed to hammer every second of tension. Mary Brower sat upright, but the tightness in her chest was impossible to hide. 15 years can't be summed up in words, and now, standing before a judge, it was as if everything she had lived was being reduced to a cruel question. Across the room, Rachel stared at the floor while her attorney prepared to attack. The accusation was clear: kidnapping. A word that cut deeper than any sentence. As if love, care, and sacrifice could be twisted into a crime. Mary clutched what she held in her hands as if her life depended on it, a brown envelope. Inside was her truth. Judge Morrison, seasoned and known for his sternness, kept a serious expression. The atmosphere was heavy, even the audience's murmurs felt out of place. When Rachel's attorney stood up, his tone was cold, almost rehearsed. He presented the case with the confidence of someone relying on the absence of legal custody papers. He called Mary a third party, as if she were a stranger who had stolen her own grandchildren. With every phrase, Mary relived the years she rushed them to the hospital, packed their lunches, sat awake through their fevers. She wasn't a babysitter. She wasn't a caretaker. She was a grandmother. And she was a mother too, even if no one said it out loud. But in that courtroom, love wasn't enough. Proof was required. Mary took a deep breath, rose with difficulty, and with steady hands walked to the center of the room. She handed the brown envelope to the judge. Inside were years of struggle, transformed into papers. School records, enrollment authorizations, medical prescriptions, letters signed by doctors and principals, even a handwritten list of every vaccine the boys had taken under her care. Each item carefully preserved, as if she knew one day someone might try to erase her story. It wasn't a scrapbook, it was an arsenal of defense. And while she didn't have an official custody order, what she did have were undeniable proofs of real guardianship, built on presence and devotion. On the other side, Rachel remained silent. Her hands trembled on her lap, while her lawyer tried to dismiss it all, saying those sentimental papers held no legal value, that they couldn't replace judicial rulings. But the judge frowned as he leafed through them. The dates matched. The names aligned. The signatures were there. It was impossible to ignore. The courtroom was stunned. The accusation began to crumble under the weight of reality. This wasn't just a custody case, it was a story of abandonment, sacrifice, and a desperate attempt to erase the past. The silence was broken by Judge Morrison, who looked at Rachel firmly and demanded an explanation. His request was direct: can you justify your absence in these documents for over a decade? Rachel hesitated. Her words came out shaky, as if she were searching for an escape within herself. But all she managed was, "I was sick." The judge's expression hardened. Sickness doesn't justify a complete disappearance, not showing up for birthdays, school reports, graduations. And there it was, the contradiction laid bare. While Mary gathered evidence, Rachel had only gathered excuses. The court was beginning to understand that this story had two sides and only one of them rang true. Rachel's attorney tried a new attack. He argued that the maternal family had been unfairly cut off and that Mary had taken advantage of the situation. But just one look at the documents was enough to see it made no sense. The photos showed the children growing up healthy, celebrating birthdays with friends, participating in school events. Nothing there suggested isolation. On the contrary, it showed real love and care. The judge began putting the pieces together. And the more he read, the more Rachel's case collapsed. What was at stake wasn't just custody, but an inheritance, maybe even a life insurance policy from the boy's father who had passed away just a few years earlier. Mary suspected that was behind Rachel's sudden interest. She didn't want her children, she wanted what they represented financially. That made it even more cruel. The betrayal wasn't only emotional, it was legal, financial, and deeply personal. As if the whole performance was just a way to take something she had never built. Mary looked at her grandsons sitting in the back of the courtroom, now teenagers, trying to mask their tension. They knew the truth, but hadn't yet been called to speak. Their time was coming. And the court was preparing to hear what could be the decisive turning point. This was only the beginning of a trial that would change lives. And it had all started with a brown envelope, ordinary on the outside, but bursting with stories inside. Something many would have thrown away, Mary had kept, guarding it as if protecting a piece of her soul. It wasn't just her defense. It was her biography, written in love, tears, and sleepless nights. What she didn't yet know was that in the coming days, the court would hear truths nobody was ready to face. And even with all her evidence, the pain would still find many ways to manifest. The moment everyone feared finally arrived. Judge Morrison, firm and direct, ordered Rachel to stand and give her version of events. The silence was so heavy you could feel its weight in the air. Mary Brower watched without blinking. After so many years, this would be the first true confrontation, not just between two women, but between two stories. One marked by constant presence, the other by painful absence. Rachel stood, visibly uncomfortable. Her eyes avoided contact. Her trembling voice carried the weight of someone who didn't know where to begin. I had problems, she said. But it wasn't enough. Morrison, impatient with vague answers, pressed further. Do you have any documentation proving you maintained contact with your children during these 15 years? The question hung in the air like a blade. Rachel swallowed hard. Her attorney shuffled some papers aimlessly and shook his head. There was nothing. No letters. No emails. No record of visits. Meanwhile, Mary had handed over a meticulous chronology: photos, school reports, medical records, all with dates, signatures, context. Each document a brick in the wall of truth. And what did Rachel have? Nothing but a poorly told story. The defense strategy began to collapse. And it only became clearer when Mary was invited to detail her routine with the boys. With a calm voice and dignified posture, she began recalling those first days after the abandonment. Sleepless nights when Daniel had asthma. Lucas high fevers. The fear of losing little Miguel after a bad fall in the yard. Each story came backed by a corresponding document, a medical record, a photo, even thank you notes from teachers. This wasn't just care. It was real love, translated into daily action. And right there, before everyone, it became undeniable. Rachel tried to interrupt, claiming the situation was more complicated than it seemed. She mentioned being diagnosed with depression, saying it kept her from fulfilling her role as a mother. The judge didn't dismiss the argument, but responded firmly: even in the worst moments, you had opportunities to take legal action. Why did you never try to regain custody, or even contact them formally? The answer was a heavy silence. Mary, without irony, just observed. Because she knew the difference between them was in the choices made every single day, not just in moments of crisis. And that was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom. To strengthen the case, the judge asked the legal team to review the dates on Mary's documents. At the same time, he ordered the boys to be prepared to testify. The atmosphere shifted. From a battle between adults, the process now turned to the children. Those boys, grown but scarred by the past, would now have a voice. It was a delicate step but necessary. Mary's heart tightened. Because no matter how much she trusted the truth, she knew their pain would also come to light. A court doesn't just judge papers. It judges intentions, bonds, and above all lived stories. Rachel's defense, now under pressure, tried a new path. They attempted to discredit the records, claiming many could have been falsified or easily manipulated. But the words sounded desperate. The judge called for calm. He said he knew the kind of care some grandmothers gave, and that it wasn't uncommon to see them step in as primary caregivers. The difference, he stated, is that you, Rachel, disappeared completely. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The truth was asserting itself. What had first sounded like an exaggeration, accusations of abandonment, now seemed the only plausible explanation for those 15 missing years. Mary felt a wave of relief mixed with sorrow. Relief that her truth was finally being recognized. Sorrow because nothing could return the years the boys had spent trying to understand why their mother hadn't wanted them. The judge then suspended the session for a few minutes. He needed to carefully review the documents before hearing from the grandsons. During that break, Mary sat quietly, her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on the brown envelope now resting on the judge's table. Inside wasn't just her defense. It was her life. And soon, the boys' voices would become the final echo of that truth. All eyes turned toward the back of the room, where the grandsons waited. They were no longer hidden in the shadows of doubt. They were ready to speak. And even though no one knew exactly what they would say, one thing was certain: they would not speak as children. They would speak as young men marked by experience, by absence, and by the silent sacrifice of the woman who had raised them. The next chapter would be the hardest because it would test not just blood ties, but the ties of life itself. And in battles like this, biology isn't always the strongest bond. Mary had always been the kind of woman who kept everything: the first lock of haircut, the messy preschool drawings, even a homemade recipe that once soothed a midnight cough. Not out of excessive attachment, but because every little scrap of paper held a memory. And in that courtroom, those memories became weapons of defense. Opening one of the folders she carried, she pulled out a letter written by Daniel at 8 years old. It had spelling mistakes and a lopsided heart drawn in red crayon. But it said everything: Grandma, thank you for loving me when I'm sad. That was it. In just a few words, a child revealed what his life was like: true love, presence, affection. There was no room for doubt. Rachel had never been there. And Mary's memories weren't just written on paper. They were etched into the new lines on her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she pronounced her grandsons' names as if they were part of her own. She remembered the terror when Lucas burned with fever, and the relief when he smiled the next morning. She recalled the nights when Daniel cried in secret, unable to understand his mother's disappearance. Each pain was matched by small victories: the first school diploma, a chess tournament medal, a tight Christmas hug. Rachel knew nothing of these moments. She had been absent when it mattered most, and that absence had a name: abandonment. Mary also knew the names of their classmates, their teachers, even the nurse at the clinic who helped when Miguel needed stitches after falling in the yard. Every story she told was full of detail. She never had to invent anything. All she needed was memory. Meanwhile, Rachel's gaze remained distant, as if she herself were hearing these events for the first time. Because, in truth, she was. The life Mary had lived with the boys, Rachel could only imagine. And even if she wanted to rebuild bonds now, it was too late to erase years of silence and distance. With every story Mary told, the court saw more clearly who had truly been a mother in the boys' lives. The most emotional moment came when Mary spoke about birthdays. She made sure to celebrate every single one. Even with little money, there was always cake, balloons, and a handwritten card. I never let a birthday pass unnoticed, she said, her voice trembling. Because everyone deserves to know they were born and that they matter. The judge listened in silence. Rachel looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Mary wasn't just defending herself, she was teaching a lesson on what it means to be present. The custody she had exercised wasn't written in legal papers, but in repeated gestures, daily care, and love that had never failed. She recalled late-night emergency room visits, bronchitis attacks, medical exams, antibiotics forced down because Miguel hated syrup. And afterward, always the comfort of her lap. Rachel didn't know what it was like to fall asleep sitting up with a feverish child in her arms. But Mary did, and she did it gladly. For her, caring for her grandsons was never an obligation. It was a choice. Every single day, even tired, even afraid, she chose to stay. And that consistency, more than any legal term, was the greatest proof of motherhood she could present. The court listened and took notes, but the tears in people's eyes said more than any verdict. Mary also recounted the milestones: the first lost tooth, the first childhood crush, the first heartbreak at school. She had been there for all of it, documenting with photos, home videos, little notes. Her grandsons didn't just live with her. They were part of her soul. Rachel didn't even know the names of their best friends. When asked about their most recent birthdays, she stammered, trying to remember the youngest's birth month. Cruel, but revealing. The biological mother didn't know her own children. And the woman accused of kidnapping was, in truth, the only one who had never abandoned them. The highlight came when Mary produced a notebook. She called it Our Stories. Inside were entries written by her and the boys over the years. Memories, promises, even confessions. One passage, written by Lucas at 13, read, "I don't know where my mom is, but I know my grandma never left me." The words split the courtroom open. Rachel cried, perhaps from regret, perhaps from shame. But there, in front of everyone, there was no hiding. The past spoke louder than any new claim. Every line written in that notebook was living proof of what had truly happened during those 15 years. And even with all that emotional weight, Mary showed no anger. Her posture radiated dignity. She wasn't there to win. She was there to protect. And that, in itself, said everything. The court began to see the case not as a mere legal dispute, but as a painful portrait of a mother's negligence and a grandmother's total devotion. Every memory Mary shared was another brick in rebuilding the truth. And still, she wasn't seeking punishment, only justice. Because in the end, what she truly wanted was peace for her grandsons. Even if that meant reliving all of it again. Judge Morrison took a deep breath before calling Rachel to speak again. The courtroom was torn between disbelief and compassion, trying to understand what could justify a mother's 15-year disappearance. It was her chance to present her truth if she had one. Rachel stood, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue, and began to speak. Her voice trembled with fragility, but also with defense. She said she had suffered from severe depression, that she had fallen into addictions, that she didn't even have the strength to care for herself, let alone 3 children. She claimed Mary had never allowed her to get close. But every word sounded more like an excuse than a confession. Mary listened in silence. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. She simply let the court hear her daughter's version. Then the judge allowed her to respond. Mary rose, her tone calm but firm. She looked into her daughter's eyes and said, "Love is a daily choice. I had depression too, when your father died. I cried alone too. But I chose to keep going. For my grandsons. And even for you, though you were gone." The courtroom froze. It was impossible not to be moved by the strength of those words. They weren't words of anger, but of truth. A clear portrait of how real love isn't about the absence of pain, it's about the decision to stay. The judge, realizing the heart of the matter was no longer purely legal but profoundly emotional, ordered that the 3 grandsons be heard. One by one, they walked in, hearts in their hands and eyes steady. Daniel, the oldest, was the first to sit down. He looked at the judge, then at his mother. His voice was firm, without arrogance. When asked whom he wished to live with, he answered with a phrase that froze the room: "We don't know her." It wasn't said with anger, but with a cutting honesty. Rachel covered her mouth in shock. And Mary, though her heart broke at the words, knew they came from the truth that could no longer be denied. Lucas, the second, was called next. He followed the same path. He said that for years he had fantasized about his mother's return. But when she finally appeared, all he felt was fear. Fear of losing his grandmother. Fear of his life turning upside down. She doesn't know my favorite color. She doesn't know I hate carrots. But Grandma knows. She always has. The judge wrote in silence, his eyes attentive. This was no longer about custody. It was about bonds, recognition, and identity. Rachel, before her own children, looked like a stranger trying to force her way into a home she had never built. Miguel, the youngest, hesitated. He was only 14, with the timid voice of someone who had spent his life listening more than speaking. But when he finally found courage, he let out what he had been holding for years: "I called Grandma Mom when I was little. Because I thought a mom was the one who takes care of you." The words shook the room. Some wept, others lowered their heads. And in that simple, direct statement lay the essence of the trial. Mary Brower, an ordinary woman holding a brown envelope like a shield, was the one truly responsible for keeping the family together. While Rachel fought for rights, Mary had lived her duties. Judge Morrison called for silence and addressed the boys directly. He told them he would not make any decision without considering their wishes. And more than that, that they had the right to be heard and respected. Rachel still tried to argue, saying she could rebuild the bond, that she was ready to start again. But the boys were clear they were not ready. And maybe they never would be. It was harsh but real. Mary stayed silent, tears in her eyes, but without a trace of pride over what could be seen as an emotional victory. This wasn't about winning. It was about protecting her grandsons even if it shattered her heart. While the lawyers scrambled to salvage what they could, the judge suspended the hearing for several hours. He needed to weigh the testimonies, the documents, and above all, the emotional weight at play. Mary left the courtroom with her grandsons, in silence. Rachel remained behind with her lawyer. The difference between the two scenes was striking: one left surrounded by love she had built. The other, trapped in the loneliness she had created. And the inevitable question hung in the air: what makes someone a mother? Blood or daily care? The court seemed to have found its answer. But more was yet to come. The battle in the courtroom was not over, but the scales were tipping. And it wasn't toward the written law, it was toward true justice. The kind that recognizes the value of constant love, of uncelebrated dedication, of invisible care that shapes lives. Mary knew the coming days would be hard. But she also knew her grandsons stood with her not out of obligation, but by choice. And that choice, born of affection, was the greatest victory any grandmother could ever have. The courtroom slowly filled again, but the air was different now. Judge Morrison returned, his face even more severe than before. A sign the testimonies had moved him deeply. He asked everyone to sit. All eyes turned to Daniel, called once more to the center. It was the decisive moment. He looked at Mary, then at Rachel, and finally at the judge. "I speak for my brothers too," he began, with a tone far older than his 17 years of maturity forced upon him by life. "We're grateful for everything. But we don't feel she's our mother. She had her chance, and she chose not to be there." The judge asked him to be clearer about whom they wished to stay with. Daniel took a deep breath and answered with Grandma. "It's always been with her. There's no reason to change now." The declaration brought absolute silence. Rachel lowered her head, while Mary closed her eyes for a moment, as if offering a silent prayer of gratitude. That sentence carried not only the preference of a teenager, but the weight of an entire childhood. It wasn't a decision made on impulse. It was built on sleepless nights of care, on medicine given at the right time, on a loving note slipped into a backpack, on a hug after a tough exam. It was the kind of choice born not of appearances, but of lived truth. The judge leaned back in his chair, letting Daniel's words sink into the silence. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath. Rachel's attorney shifted uneasily, clearly aware that nothing could undo what had just been said. The truth had come, not from documents or legal arguments, but from the very voices of the children whose lives had been shaped by absence and devotion. Rachel tried once more to speak, her voice shaking. "I can change, I can try again. I just want another chance." But her words hung weakly in the air. They were no match for the testimony of 3 sons who had already lived their reality. No speech could erase birthdays missed, tears unseen, or hugs never given. Mary remained still, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes lowered. She didn't gloat. She didn't look at Rachel with reproach. Instead, her heart ached not for victory, but for the lost years her grandsons would never get back. Her fight had never been against her daughter. Her fight was for her grandson's right to peace, stability, and love. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, his voice firm, but now softer than before. This court recognizes that motherhood cannot be measured solely by biology, but by presence, care, and responsibility. In the eyes of this court, and most importantly, in the eyes of these boys, Mary Brower has been their true guardian. Custody will remain with her. A wave of murmurs spread through the room, followed by an emotional hush. The decision was clear, final, and undeniable. Rachel buried her face in her hands, shoulders trembling. The boys instinctively turned toward their grandmother, as if drawn to the gravity of her love. Mary reached for them, pulling them close, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had never let go. In that moment, the brown envelope sat quietly on the judge's tableau, no longer just evidence, but a symbol. Proof that small acts, saved and remembered, could one day stand as the strongest defense against injustice. That envelope was filled with report cards, doctor's notes, and childhood letters, but more than that, it carried years of sleepless nights, quiet sacrifices, and an unshakable choice to stay. The hearing was adjourned. People began to leave, whispering among themselves, many wiping tears they hadn't expected to shed. Mary remained seated for a moment, her hand resting on Miguel's shoulder, her heart heavy yet relieved. She knew the trial had ended, but the scars would remain. Healing would take time, but the bond she had built with her grandsons was unbreakable. As they walked out of the courthouse together, the boys at her side, the afternoon sun hit their faces. It felt like more than just light, it felt like release. They weren't leaving with riches or triumphs. They were leaving with truth. And truth, once spoken, could never be silenced. And perhaps the deepest lesson of it all was this: being a mother isn't about blood alone. It's about the daily decision to love, to protect, to stay even when it hurts. Mary Brower hadn't asked for this battle, but she had faced it with dignity. And in the end, she showed the world that real family is built not only by birth, but by the hands that never let you fall. If stories like this move you, if you believe love and sacrifice deserve to be honored, stay with us. Because each story we tell carries not just pain, but the power of truth. And don't forget subscribe to the channel, so you never miss the next chapter of courage, resilience, and the strength of the human heart. Lucas reinforced what his brother had said. He explained there was no hatred, but there was distance. And even if Rachel had changed, they couldn't pretend those years hadn't happened. She says she loves us, but she doesn't even know our dog's name. The comment drew a nervous laugh from a few in the room, but beneath it was pain. Rachel, shrinking in her seat, twisted her fingers together. It was a stark contrast to the firmness of her sons. The judge took notes, paying attention to every word. This wasn't theater. This was the result of 15 years of silence, now replaced by an avalanche of truth. Miguel, more reserved, asked not to speak from the stand. With the judge's permission, he handed over a handwritten letter. Mary tried not to read it with her eyes, but from afar she recognized the still-developing handwriting. The judge read it aloud, pausing between the lines. "Dear Judge, I like my mom, but I don't know her. I'm afraid she'll take me away, and I'll be far from my home. My home is where Grandma is. And with the sweetness and honesty of a child, he defined everything. This wasn't a custody battle anymore. It was a plea for permanence, for stability, for a love that doesn't fail. Rachel's lawyer tried to argue that minors didn't have the legal capacity to decide and that blood ties should weigh more heavily. But the judge was firm. They may not have legal age, but they are fully aware of what they lived. And it is not my role to ignore that. It was a slap without a Hondan elegant way of saying the defense was out of touch with reality. The court was leaning toward the boy's words, and that was a turning point. Mary didn't celebrate. She knew no victory here came without cost. But deep inside, she felt truth was finally finding its place. Rachel then made her last attempt. She stood crying, and asked to speak directly to her sons. She told them she loved them, that she regretted her mistakes, that she wanted to make up for lost time. She promised trips, time together, a new life. But the boys didn't move. They looked at her with respect, but with an invisible barrier between them. Daniel summed it up: it's not about what you promise now. It's about where you were when we needed you most. The words landed like a sentence. Rachel sat back down, this time defeated not because she had lost a case, but because she had realized she had lost a story. The judge postponed the ruling for another day, but the verdict already seemed clear. The boys' statements had been strong, consistent, and undeniable. Impossible to ignore. As they left the courtroom, Mary held Miguel's hand tightly. Lucas walked on the other side, with Daniel one step behind, quietly observing everything. There were no smiles, just a silence heavy with truth. The legal battle might drag on for a few more sessions, but the emotional one was already won. The boys had chosen where they wanted to be. And more than that, they had chosen not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The pain would still echo for a while, but their decision was a firm step toward emotional freedom. Mary knew this wasn't the end. Rachel wouldn't give up so easily. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. Her grandsons stood beside her, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And no lawyer, sentence, or document could take that away. It was the hardest, quietest, most painful, and most just victory. That night, the house was silent, but not with fear. It was the silence of people who needed to think. Mary carried out a sacred ritual: hot chocolate, thick ceramic mugs, and blankets on the couch. The boys, still tense from the trial, sat around the table as they had on so many difficult nights. No speeches, just the clinking of spoons stirring the warm drink. That was how they faced the world together, in silence, until someone dared to speak. It was Daniel who broke the ice. "Do you think she'll come back tomorrow?" Mary sighed, taking a sip before answering. "Maybe. But that doesn't change who we are." The answer was simple, but layered. They knew Rachel wouldn't give up easily. And they also knew the war was far from over. But in that moment, what weighed most wasn't the threat of losing custody. It was doubt. The kind of doubt that slips in uninvited. What if she really has changed? What if we're being too harsh? Mary didn't judge. She simply held space for them. Doubt is also a form of love, she said. But love should never make you forget who has protected you all this time. Lucas, usually quiet, asked a question that hung in the air: does she want us or the money? Mary hesitated. It wasn't fair for boys to have to think about that. But she couldn't shield them from the world forever. So she opened the subject she had avoided for years: their father's life insurance. A sum locked under his will, accessible only when they turned 18 by a legal guardian with recognized custody. That, perhaps, was the true reason behind Rachel's sudden return. And that hurt more than any accusation made in court. Daniel narrowed his eyes, trying to understand. "So you mean she could take the money if she wins custody?" Mary nodded, her sorrow visible. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. Suddenly everything made sense: the sudden lawsuit, the rush, the dramatics. Rachel didn't just want her family back. She wanted control. She wanted access. And the boys understood it cruelly, like someone waking from a beautiful dream to face raw reality. There were no tears. Just silence. The heavy silence of growing up in an instant. Miguel, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "She never asked how I was." The words fell like a stone. No one answered. Mary simply stood and hugged him. Because there was nothing else to say. The boys were processing a truth too heavy for their age. The woman they had once dreamed of seeing again wasn't the same woman now fighting for custody. And deep down, it wasn't about whether they could forgive. It was about realizing love can't be bought with empty promises. It's built day by day. With hot chocolate, arms that hold you, and presents. That night was full of questions and short on answers. But one thing was clear: their trust in Mary was unshaken. Even with doubts, there was one certainty holding the house together: the feeling of belonging. "You're our root," Lucas said before going upstairs to bed. Mary stayed in the kitchen, washing mugs slowly. She thought about it all: the trial, her daughter, her grandsons. And how life could be both cruel and generous at the same time. That family had been born of sacrifice, but it survived because of love. As the house quieted, Mary looked at an old photo frame of the boys as children. She missed the days when a kiss could heal any pain. Now, they faced adult decisions. And even young, they already understood that truth doesn't always come wrapped in good intentions. Rachel would return the next day, probably with more promises, more tears, more speeches. But nothing could shake what Mary had built. Because her love didn't need proving. It was already there in every choice she made, every sleepless night, every silence she respected. The next morning was heavy. There were no words to describe how Mary felt leaving home with the boys for court. The coffee sat cold on the table. The silence in the car was thicker than ever. They all knew the day would bring revelations. But none expected them to be so painful. The surprise came right away: a new witness was called. An ex-colleague of Rachel's late husband. And with him came a new sealed brown envelope, stamped by a notary. Inside? Evidence that would change the case completely. The envelope contained financial documents, suspicious transactions, and emails linking Rachel and her late husband to a corporate fraud scheme. The dates matched exactly the years she had disappeared. While Mary was raising the boys, Rachel had been involved with a man under investigation for corruption, money laundering, and embezzlement. The bomb hit the courtroom. Judge Morrison had to pause the session to verify the documents. When he returned, his expression betrayed his shock. This was no longer about custody. There was a new element: financial interest disguised as redemption. Daniel looked at his mother with a mix of anger and disappointment. There were no more excuses. Rachel's sudden return, the rushed case, everything now made sense. It was a desperate attempt to access the insurance money, maybe even the inheritance that had been frozen by the courts. The impact was devastating. Rachel couldn't defend herself. She sat pale as the judge read the reports aloud. Mary stayed still. She had suspected, of course. But hearing it officially was like taking a punch to the stomach. Lucas whispered to his brother, "She only came back for the money." The words were spoken with sadness, not hatred. But they were the emotional turning point. From that moment, the boys no longer saw themselves as victims of her absence. They realized they had been part of a cruel strategy, used as pawns for a hidden goal. The awakening was like lightning. The fragile dream of reconciliation shattered. The bond with Rachel, already broken, was gone for good. Rachel tried to claim she hadn't known about her husband's crimes, that she'd been confused and manipulated. But the evidence was clear. She had signed documents, transferred money, taken active part. The worst part was realizing her return to the boys had likely been calculated not for love, but for convenience. The court now saw everything clearly. Judge Morrison suspended the hearing again, this time to consider new measures. Mary said nothing. She simply held Miguel, who was shaking. The boys, though devastated, stayed strong. They knew it was time to close the door on the past. During the break, Mary's lawyer made a proposal: end the custody case based on the new evidence, open a fraud case against Rachel, and request legal protection for the boys. It was the hardest path but the safest. Mary didn't want revenge, but she knew justice had to be done. More importantly, she had to protect her grandsons from future manipulation. Because if Rachel had tried once, she could try again. The safest way now was to cut all legal ties until they were adults and could choose for themselves. Back home that night, the boys were different. They were no longer the confused teenagers of days before. A new strength shone in them, a maturity forged by pain. Daniel spoke plainly. "We get it now, Grandma. And we're with you." Mary, overwhelmed, just smiled sadly. She knew what they had lost was irretrievable. But she also knew what they had now was real, solid, earned through years of love. And despite everything, it was there that their family's rebuilding truly began, without illusions, lies, or masks. Mary knew she had to face Rachel directly. No court, no lawyers, just the two of them. She arranged the meeting at Rosewood Cafe, a place full of memories, with her grandsons. Rachel arrived looking worn down, visibly nervous. Mary watched her calmly. She placed an envelope on the table, not brown this time, but white, and slid it across to her. Inside were financial records tying Rachel and her late husband to the suspicious transactions. Bank statements, signatures, transaction logs. It was the confirmation Mary had always suspected. Rachel's return hadn't been about love, it had been about the inheritance and the life insurance. Rachel tried to justify herself, but no argument could stand against that truth. Mary was direct. "You didn't come back for the boys. You came back because you had nothing left." Rachel broke down, speaking of debts, of her husband abandoning her before his death, of bankruptcy. But Mary didn't yield. "They are not currency," she said firmly. The threat was clear: either Rachel dropped the case or face public exposure. Rachel tried to appeal, insisting she was still their mother, that she had rights. But Mary cut her off with a single sentence that ended the discussion: "A mother is the one who stays." It was the final line this story needed. No shouting, no scene, just truth, raw and undeniable, laid out on the table like a bill Rachel refused to pay. When Rachel left the cafe, she said nothing. Mary remained seated, staring at her empty cup. There was no relief, but there was closure. That conversation had been harder than any court hearing. And for the first time, Mary felt she had drawn a line. Not to hurt but to protect. Back home, she found her grandsons laughing, playing as if the world might still be repaired. And maybe it could. She only said it's settled. The boys didn't ask for details. Deep down, they knew their grandmother would do whatever it took to secure the peace they had rebuilt together. A few days later, the news arrived: Rachel had officially withdrawn her case. No apology. No explanation. Just silence. Mary knew this was the result of that meeting at Rosewood. And though she would have preferred to go on without that confrontation, she recognized that sometimes, true love requires courage. This wasn't about winning. It was about closing cycles. And in that small, old cafe, Mary cut the final thread that still tied her to the past. What came next would no longer be about disputes, but about rebuilding. The fall was swift. Less than a week after Rosewood, Rachel was formally indicted. The evidence Mary had provided, now officially attached to the case, proved her involvement in financial fraud with her late husband. She tried to deny it, but the documents spoke for themselves. Preventive arrest was ordered. The justification: risk of flight and destruction of evidence. The woman who had tried to take her children by force now found herself with no friends, no money, no defense. News outlets spread the story. Headlines highlighted the irony: a daughter who sued her own mother for kidnapping. Mary didn't celebrate. The pain of seeing her daughter imprisoned was real, though mixed with relief. The grandsons were shaken. Even if they no longer trusted Rachel, it was hard to accept their mother's crimes. Daniel spoke plainly: "We wanted answers. Not this." Lucas only lowered his head. In desperation, Rachel tried to bargain leniency in exchange for confessing, even dangling custody rights in hopes of house arrest. She dreamed of reconciliation. But the judge was firm. The request was denied. When Mary heard, she simply said, "My grandsons are not for sale." And with that, she closed every door to manipulation. A letter arrived in the mail, written by Rachel. She asked for forgiveness, claimed it had all been out of fear and need. The boys read it together. Then they decided they would not visit her. Daniel summed it up: "She had 15 years to look for us. Now, it's not our turn." Painful, but necessary. The custody case was formally closed. The court ruled permanent guardianship for Mary, with no right of appeal. Justice had finally aligned with what had always been true in practice: she was the real guardian. With time, Rachel's name faded from conversation. The boys returned to their routines, their plans, their dreams. Mary breathed easier. The worst was behind them, though scars remained. But now there was space to heal, uninterrupted. Rachel stayed where she had placed herself, outside. Not as punishment, but as consequence. And Mary realized that sometimes the harshest prison has no bars. It's the absence of true love, of bonds, of roots. That was the greatest punishment her daughter could ever receive. The calm after the storm felt strange at first. But little by little, the boys began to take new roles in the story as protagonists. Daniel pursued an internship. Lucas started tutoring neighborhood kids. Miguel, shy as ever, began drawing again. Each, in his own way, was reconnecting with life. Their choice to stay with Mary was no longer about defense. It was a statement. They weren't there because they had to, but they were there because they wanted to. They knew they could have chosen another path. But they chose to remain. Not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And for Mary, that meant more than any courtroom victory. The public exposure of their story brought curious stares, invasive questions. But the three of them grew closer than ever. They made a pact: no shame, no lies. "We went through it together. And we'll stay together," Daniel said. Mary listened and felt that, despite everything, she had won. They began to take more part in family life, helping with bills, house decisions, looking after each other. Lucas took Miguel to the doctor. Daniel fixed the old gate. Simple gestures, but proof they were becoming men with strong roots. One night, Daniel made an unexpected suggestion, changing their last name. "I want to be Daniel Brower. I think my brothers do too." Mary cried. This was more than gratitude. It was belonging. It was saying to the world, "This is my family." Lucas, ever reserved, said, "Only this name took care of us." Miguel added, "This name saved us." Symbolic. A gesture that buried abandonment once and for all, and began the rebuilding of family on choice, not blood. The paperwork started days later. At school, on official forms, even online. They signed Brower with pride. To some, just a name. To them, a rebirth. A declaration that they weren't defined by the past, but by the choices they made now. Mary had never asked for it. But receiving that recognition was the greatest gift she could imagine. She hadn't raised her grandsons to keep them, she raised them to choose. And they chose. With awareness, with maturity, with their hearts. The Brower house began to breathe lighter again. With the trial over, the boys returned to their goals. Daniel was accepted into university, Lucas began a technical course, and Miguel kept drawing. Their routine flowed calmly, in a way it never had before. Then came a surprise: the boys presented Mary with a project for a new home. It was their gift. A house plan with a big porch, room for everyone, and a symbolic name: Brower House. It sealed their new beginning. Mary cried not for the material gift, but for its meaning. The boys were now building their own future, but chose to keep her at the center. It was the reflection of the love she had planted for so many years. Between decisions and construction plans, laughter returned to the kitchen, dinners together, dreams shared at dusk. Rebuilding hadn't come with grandeur, but with presence. And that was enough. With everything settled, Mary understood something important: vengeance wasn't necessary. Time itself had carried out justice. Rachel had lost what she tried to take, not only legally, but emotionally. She was left alone. Without her children, without bonds, without roots. Mary's greatest victory wasn't custody, nor the end of the case. It was seeing her grandsons grow into men of integrity, kindness, and justice. They learned early that love isn't begged for, it's cultivated, given, lived. The real justice wasn't the kind that came from the judge's gavel, but the kind born from daily choices. Mary chose to love when she had every reason to give up. And that choice saved 3 lives. On the porch, watching the boys talk, she thought they won. And with that, she smiled in peace. The lesson had been learned. The legacy was safe. Justice doesn't always appear in the form we expect. Sometimes, it isn't in a courtroom, in a sentence, or in a formal ruling. Sometimes, it happens quietly, at home, in a hug, over a meal. That's what Mary Brower discovered in a journey marked by abandonment, sacrifice, and above all love. She hadn't chosen to be a mother again. She was forced into it by the absence of the one who should have filled that role. But instead of complaining, she did what many would have done out of duty, except she did it out of love. And that makes all the difference. For 15 years, she fed, taught, protected 3 children who hadn't asked to live without a mother, but who found in her everything they needed to grow with dignity. Rachel had every chance to change the story. But she chose the easier path: silence, neglect. When she returned, it wasn't out of repentance, but out of self-interest. And that was her fatal mistake. Because no legal paper can rebuild bonds that were never nurtured. No lawyer can recover what was willingly thrown away. The story of Mary and the Brower boys is more than a family dispute. It forces us to look inward and ask, who are the people who truly stand by us? Who stays when everything falls apart? And the most important, have we been that person for someone? In the end, the greatest inheritance Mary left her grandsons wasn't a name, or a new house, or even a favorable ruling. It was her example. The kind that isn't taught with words, but with constancy. A legacy of presence, strength, and love that withstood time, pain, and even attempts at destruction. And that is why this story must be told. Because there are still many Marys out there. Women who carry the world in their arms, who raise children and grandchildren with the little they have, who give up their own lives to guarantee someone else's future. They don't make headlines. They don't win trophies. But they are the true architects of what we call home. So if this story touched you in any way, if it reminded you of someone who raised you when you needed it most, or if it made you reflect on how choices build or destroy families, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And above all, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here, we tell stories that aren't just emotional, but transformative. And if you want more stories like this one, drop a comment below, I want more. Because sometimes, all someone needs to change is to hear a truth no one else dared to tell.